es Becka.
Mi nombre es Pablo.
My name's Sam.
Thanks for watching us on DPS TV.
So in a recent video, we talked about the idea that genes, which are segments of DNA on one of your chromosomes, code for specific physical traits in a living organism. And we talked about the idea that really that's because those genes code for specific proteins, and then it's the action of those proteins in your bodies or in the body of a living organism that creates the physical traits that make up that living organism. Now, if we think about humans, all humans share more than 99% of our DNA is identical human to human. And that makes some sense, right? Because all humans have hands, a nose, a mouth, eyes. You know, our bodies are relatively shaped the same way. We've got a head up here, a torso, legs. If our DNA was significantly different, we would be built in different ways. So we all expect to have the same parts and generally to have most of the same proteins running all the functions in our bodies. But in less than 1% of our DNA, there is difference. There are some differences that determine all of the differences that we see, all the variation that we see in human beings. And so one example of variation that we sometimes focus on is eye color. So that's an obvious thing. We see it in all kinds of different people. It can be kind of exciting to talk about people's eye color and where they came from. Do I have the same color eyes as my parents? And why is that? And why not? An interesting way to sort of tackle this question is to think about blue eyes. So in the United States, about 16% of the population of the United States has blue eyes. Now that's a decent chunk, and you might think, okay, blue eyes are rare, so that makes sense. But it might surprise you to know that back in the year 1900, or around the turn of the century, we had about 50% of the population of the United States with blue eyes. And so over time, we've seen a change in the percentage of blue eyes. And part of that can have to do with the fact that blue eyes is what we call a recessive trait. So if we could jump to my screen really quickly. We talked in the last video about the idea that an allele is the name for a version of a gene. So if we have a gene that was given to us by our parents as a specific gene that codes for our eye color, let's say, or in this case, it's going to be for a protein called melanin that helps to give color to the iris of our eyes. So if there's a specific gene that codes for that, there can be different versions of that gene. And so one version of that gene would be a version of the gene that codes for a brown eye, that produces enough melanin so that a person has brown eyes. And then there's another version of the gene where the body produces less melanin, and that lowered melanin production results in blue eyes, or what we see as blue eyes. It turns out that actually people that have blue eyes actually have mostly clear cells in their iris, and then what we're seeing as blue is actually the light that enters the eye being scattered, and we're seeing blue wavelengths of light, but that's a conversation for another day. Generally speaking, though, if we have these two versions of a gene, okay, the brown eye gene seems to be more powerful than the blue eye gene. Meaning that if a person ends up with a brown eye gene and a blue eye gene, it's the brown eye gene that's going to be expressed. When a gene does that, when it sort of takes over another gene, we refer to it as a dominant allele or a dominant gene. So the brown eye gene here is dominant. Blue eyes, or the blue eye gene in this example, is what we would call recessive. And the reason we call it recessive is because it recedes behind or below the dominant trait. It's not expressed when the dominant trait is present. However, if a person has only the recessive gene, then that recessive gene characteristic will be expressed. So again, blue eyes in this example, blue eyes are a recessive gene. Now, the way that we think about dominant and recessive genes is we'll give sort of a letter code to help represent these dominant and recessive genes. So we're going to pick a letter to represent this gene. And the letter that we're going to pick is B. And what we're picking B for brown, typically the letter that we choose comes from the physical characteristic of the dominant trait. So in this case, the dominant trait we're going to represent with the capital letter B. And the recessive trait is always given as the same letter but lowercase. So the recessive trait is lowercase b. So for our purposes, if we say that a person has a big B gene, that means they have a dominant gene. If they have a little b, that means they have the recessive gene. But as we talked about before, all people have 2 copies of each gene because we get 1 copy from mom and 1 copy from dad. So this gets us to another really key and important concept, which is the determination between a person's genotype and their phenotype. Genotype and phenotype are 2 pretty important vocabulary words in any heredity unit in a biology class. So your genotype is the type of genes you have. In other words, which alleles did you end up with? Your phenotype is which trait do you actually express? So from the example that we just looked at, one example of a genotype could be, we could say from a mother, perhaps this person's genotype, maybe they received a dominant allele, the brown eye gene, and maybe from their father they received a lowercase recessive gene, the blue eye gene. So this person's genotype would be big B, little b. What we call this, we actually call this heterozygous. This person is heterozygous because hetero means different, and what we can see here is that they have two different genes, one dominant and one recessive. That's why this person's genotype is heterozygous. But this person's phenotype is, what do they actually look like? What trait do we actually see? And so since this person has one dominant trait and one recessive trait, as we talked about before, the dominant trait is going to overwhelm the recessive trait. So this person's phenotype is going to be that they will have brown eyes because there is one dominant gene, and that dominant gene is going to take over. So again, genotype and phenotype. Let's look at another few examples before we get into Punet squares to wrap up the video. So another genotype could be that we could imagine that the person has both dominant genes. Maybe their mother and their father provided two dominant brown genes. In this case, we would say that the person's genotype is homozygous. Now, homozygous, it's almost that same word as heterozygous. It's got the main root zygous, but homo means same, whereas hetero means different. So a homozygous genotype is I've got two of the same allele. In this case, those alleles are both dominant. So this is a homozygous dominant genotype. What's the phenotype of this person? Well, again, what trait is going to be actually expressed? Well, this person has both dominant genotypes, so brown eyes are definitely going to be what's expressed. So this person's phenotype is brown eyes. All right, let's look at the last possible example. We've seen a heterozygous person with two different alleles. We've seen a homozygous dominant genotype. The last genotype that we could see is, oops, excuse me. Sometimes I scroll with my fist there unintentionally. The other genotype we could see is recessive, two of the blue-eyed genes. And in this case, this is still called a homozygous genotype. This is still a homozygous genotype because still both of the genes are the same. We have two of the same alleles, so it's homozygous. But in this case, it's not homozygous dominant, but homozygous recessive. Homozygous recessive. Okay, so there's three types of genotypes that we could have: homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. What is this person's phenotype, though? Well, this person does not have the brown eye dominant allele, so they only have the blue eye gene, so in this case, they're going to end up having blue eyes. Okay, now that's all well and good for talking about an individual person. If we know their genotype, we can determine their phenotype, no problem. But the question that we really want to answer in heredity is, if this kind of a person mates with this kind of a person, what sort of children are we going to get? And to answer that question, we use what's called a Punet square. And this red square that I've got over here, this is a Punet square, and it comes from a guy's name, Punet Square. There was a man named Reginald C. Punet who was a fan of Gregor Mendel. We mentioned Gregor Mendel in the last video. He was the Austrian monk who worked in the 19th century to do some work with breeding pea plants together to help us to determine some of these really fundamental characteristics about living organisms and heredity. And so Mendel did a lot of work around dominant traits and recessive traits, but his student, or one of these people who was sort of a student of his teaching, Reginald C. Punet, said, okay, we can actually use sort of a simple system to determine the probability of what kind of a child is going to exist. So what we do is we use a square like this with 4 spaces, and on the top we put a dad, and on the side we put a mom. And so we have to know what the father and mother's genotypes are to determine what their children's genotypes are. So let's do an example using the one that we've seen so far, which is blue eyes or brown eyes. And let's imagine that let's say that dad has blue eyes. Dad has blue eyes, and he's homozygous recessive. He has 2 recessive traits. And so what we do is we write in the 2 columns near dad, we write each of his alleles, little b to represent the 2 recessive alleles. Now let's say mom is, her phenotype is she has brown eyes, but her genotype is she's heterozygous. So we can say that mom had 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. Then what you do is you just distribute the alleles from each parent through the through the Punnett square. So again, here's mom's dominant allele. So since it's on this row, I'm going to move that dominant allele into both squares on that first row. Her recessive allele is on the second row, so I'm going to move the recessive allele into both squares on the second row. Dad can only provide a recessive allele, so into all of the squares where dad is providing genotypes, I'm going to put the recessive allele into both columns there. Okay, and so these are the 4 possible types of children that could exist. And if we think about it, what we're really saying here is we're saying that there's a probability that one of these types of children is going to come out. And each of these squares represents a 25% probability. Each of the 4 squares represents a 25% probability of what kind of a child is actually going to be created. And so you can see there's a 25% chance. Let me do this in another color so that we're not getting confused here. I'll just circle these in blue. There is a 25% chance that we're going to have a heterozygous, and another 25% chance that we're going to have a heterozygous child or offspring. So we can say there's a 50% chance that the offspring of this couple is going to be heterozygous, genotype, big B, little b, and their phenotype is going to be brown eyes because that dominant allele is going to take over. Then there's also a 50% chance, because there's 2 25% squares filled, there's a 25% chance here and a 25% chance here of having a homozygous recessive offspring, where the phenotype would actually be blue eyes. So we end up with a 50-50 chance here, and I'll write this over here. This will be the last thing that we say about this. There is a 50-50 chance, 50% chance that I'm going to end up with a heterozygous genotype and brown eyes, and a 50% chance that I'm going to end up with a homozygous recessive genotype, recessive, oof, a little sloppy, and I will end up with then the phenotype blue eyes. All right. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense, and let's just review sort of the basic idea, right? For every person, they have 2 sets of chromosomes, 1 set of chromosomes from their mom and 1 set from their dad. So that provides a set of copy of genes from the dad and from the mom, and it's really the combination of the genes from mom and dad that determine our physical traits. There are different versions of genes. Those versions are called alleles, and an allele can either be dominant or recessive. Dominant meaning it's always expressed if it's present. Recessive meaning it's not expressed if the dominant allele is present. We have several different genotypes that can exist. You can have a heterozygous genotype, where you have a mixture of 2 different types of alleles, or you can have a homozygous genotype, where you have 2 of the same alleles, either homozygous dominant, 2 dominant alleles, or homozygous recessive, 2 recessive alleles. And then finally, you have the phenotypes. Phenotypes just being whatever is actually physically expressed. Does the person have brown eyes or blue eyes? Do they have blonde hair or brown hair? Do they have wet earwax or dry earwax, or whatever the gene is that you're talking about? So hopefully this video gave you a basic understanding of how Punnett squares work. We'll continue more on heredity in some future videos. Thanks for watching this episode of Tutor This. As always, if you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, leave them in the comments below. Remember to click the like button below, and if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, hit subscribe.